I never thought I'd find myself in a situation where the seemingly stable world would start crumbling due to one wrong decision. But that's exactly how it began, with a small box that arrived at my doorstep on a Wednesday morning, and from the moment I let my loneliness overcome common sense. The box lay on the table, sealed as if mocking me. I looked at it for a long time, my hands trembling with mixed emotions: guilt, embarrassment, an inexplicable surge of excitement. Martin was on a business trip as usual. The house was quiet, empty, and I, Diana Reeves, a 56-year-old woman with an outwardly perfect life, suddenly felt the darkness of my own dissatisfaction engulfing me. I didn't even hear the front door open. I didn't hear the soft footsteps. Didn't notice that I was no longer alone in the house. At that moment, I was focused on one thing: the remote control spinning in my hand. "Just try it," I whispered to myself as if seeking approval. The hum began faintly, as if under the skin. The unusual sensation made me shudder. But then, relax. Warmth spread through my body, washing away all the stress and uncertainty. I closed my eyes, and at that very moment, his voice cut through the silence. "What are you doing?" I froze. Seconds stretched into eternity, and my pulse raced to its limit. Slowly turning my head, I met the gaze of Nick, my stepson, who for some reason was home. He stood in the doorway, his dark eyes piercing me, a mix of shock, embarrassment, and something else I couldn't understand. I immediately turned off the remote, but the sound of the ensuing silence was almost deafening. In that instant, I realized I had made a mistake that should never have been made. A mistake that was about to start destroying everything I had so carefully tried to preserve. I jumped up as if the hot air in the room had become unbearable. The remote fell from my hand, hitting the wooden floor with a short sound that echoed in my head. Nick looked at me, unmoving, and that was the worst part. His stillness, like a sharp knife, cut through any hope that he would simply ignore what he had seen. "Nick," I said, my voice hoarse and weak, as if I were speaking for the first time after a long silence. How long have you been home?" "Long enough," his reply was short, but it was enough to make the icy lump inside me even heavier. I took a step back, tangled in my own thoughts. What to say? How to explain? Can it even be explained? I felt the flush of shame rising to my cheeks while Nick finally looked away. He leaned down and picked up the remote, twirling it in his hands as if studying something unfamiliar. This isn't what you think," I began, realizing how foolish the words sounded. He looked at me, and the corners of his lips barely twitched, as if he were trying to hold back a laugh. "Really?" His voice was soft, almost gentle, but it only made the situation worse. "And what am I supposed to think?" I didn't know what to answer. I didn't know what to do. Panic gripped me. The only thing I wanted was to disappear, to erase the last few minutes from reality. But it wasn't happening. I was here, with him, in this room, in this moment that was becoming increasingly strange and awkward with each passing second. Nick took a step forward, and I instinctively backed away until I was pressed against the couch. He stopped, holding the remote between his fingers as if it were evidence against me. "You know, Diana," he said, his voice now a bit deeper, "I never thought you were so bold." Bold? I barely managed to get the word out, feeling my heart pound so hard it seemed to echo in my temples. "Yes," he smirked. "Martin often says how proper you are, how you always keep everything under control. And here," he pointed to the remote and then to me. "Well, this is something else." I opened my mouth to object but said nothing again. His gaze seemed to penetrate right through me, reading every thought, every feeling I was desperately trying to hide. And that gaze, it was the worst part. There was no judgment, no disgust, only curiosity. "Nick," I finally managed to say, trying to regain control of the situation. "This was a mistake. You shouldn't have seen it." "But I did," he interrupted me, taking another step closer. Now there was no more than 2 feet between us. His voice became softer, almost a whisper. "And you know what's strange?" I shook my head, unable to utter a word. "I'm not sure I want to forget it." He smiled, but there was something frightening in his smile, something that made me feel both cold and hot at the same time. And you? I swallowed, feeling something huge and inexplicable growing in my chest. Everything inside me screamed to stop, to say something sharp, to put everything back in place. But the words didn't come, only silence. I, I have to go, I muttered, making a dash for the stairs. I needed to get away, far from him, from this room, from myself. But his voice stopped me. Diana, he called, and I turned around, even though I knew I shouldn't. His gaze was fixed on me, and I noticed that spark in his eyes that I couldn't understand before. Are you sure you want to forget all this? I didn't answer. I just turned around and ran upstairs, feeling the air grow thicker, the walls of the house closing in around me. At that moment, I knew one thing. This wasn't just a mistake. This was the first crack in my carefully constructed life, and now it was starting to widen. I closed the bedroom door, leaning against it as if that could protect me from the abyss that had opened below. My chest heaved heavily, my heart pounded wildly, and every breath felt like a burn. Still holding the doorknob, I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, "This can't be true." But the truth was already standing before me in the form of Nick, his words and his gaze echoing in my head. I collapsed on the edge of the bed, covering my face with my hands. Shame and fear pulled me in different directions as I struggled with intrusive thoughts. His words, they sounded almost like a challenge, like a joke, but at the same time, like something more, something deep, inexplicable. I should have put an end to it right away, firmly and confidently. But instead, I ran away. I ran away from him, from myself. When I finally lifted my head, I saw my reflection in the mirror opposite. The woman looking back at me seemed tired, worn out, a stranger. What would Martin say if he knew? What would he do? The thought was unbearable. But even more unbearable was another question. What would happen next? The next morning started as usual, routine, predictable. I automatically made myself coffee, trying to focus on the ordinary things that always gave me a sense of control. But today it didn't work. Every movement felt strained, as if I were an actress in someone else's play. When I heard Nick's footsteps in the hallway, my heart raced again. I pretended to read the newspaper, trying to suppress the trembling in my hands. He entered the kitchen quietly as always, with a slight relaxedness that now seemed almost defiant to me. "Good morning," he said, drawing out the words. His voice was low and calm, as if nothing had happened. "Good morning," I replied, not looking up. He walked over to the coffee maker, poured himself a cup, and stood at the table across from me. I felt his gaze, but I was afraid to meet it. Several long seconds of silence hung in the air before he spoke again. "Did you sleep well?" I looked up, and our eyes met. There was something new in his gaze, something that made me want to look away and grip the countertop to keep from falling. "Yes," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "And you?" "Could have been better," he said, taking a sip of coffee. His tone was so casual that it only intensified my inner tension. I didn't know what to say next. My brain frantically searched for a way to change the subject, or, better yet, find an excuse to leave the kitchen. But Nick spoke again, shattering my fragile attempt to take control of the situation. "You were acting strangely yesterday," he said, his voice steady, but there was something in it that made me tense. "Do you want to talk about it?" "No," I replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "I was just tired, that's all." His gaze was heavy, but he didn't press. He just nodded, as if agreeing to leave it at that. But when he set the cup on the table and was about to leave, he paused for a moment. "You know," he said, looking back over his shoulder, "you don't have to pretend nothing happened." I stared at him, unable to believe he had actually said that. But he didn't add anything else, just gave a short smile and left, leaving me alone with a storm of thoughts. The day dragged on endlessly. I locked myself in my office, trying to focus on work, but it was useless. The events of the previous evening played over and over in my head like a broken record. Every word, every look, every gesture now seemed significant, as if I had missed some important context. When the sun began to set, I left the office and headed to the living room. Nick was sitting on the couch, scrolling through something on his phone. I froze in the doorway, not knowing if I should enter, But before I could make a decision, he looked up and noticed me. "Everything okay?" he asked, setting his phone aside. "Yes, of course," I replied, though my voice sounded too tense. He slightly raised an eyebrow, as if questioning my words, but didn't insist. "Want to watch something?" he offered, gesturing to the TV. I nodded, though I had no idea why I agreed. I sat on the other end of the couch, trying to keep as much distance as possible. Nick turned on some movie, but I couldn't focus. My attention was fixed on how he sat next to me, his movements, his presence. And again, as in the morning, I felt his gaze. When I turned, our eyes met, and this time he didn't look away. That moment lasted only a few seconds, but it felt endless. I looked away first, but the feeling of his gaze didn't leave me. The silence in the room was deafening, despite the sound of the TV. The air between us grew thicker, as if an invisible force was compressing the space. When the movie ended, Nick stood up and stretched, his movements slow, almost lazy. He looked at me again before going upstairs, and his words, whispered, almost made me scream. "Good night, Diana. Sweet dreams." He left, and I remained sitting on the couch, feeling the wall between us crumbling even more. This wasn't just a crack, it was an abyss, and I knew that if I didn't step back now, the fall would be inevitable. The following days passed in tense equilibrium. Nick and I avoided direct conversations, but the tension between us was so palpable, it seemed to fill every corner of the house. Everything that used to be ordinary and safe now turned into a playing field, the rules of which I couldn't understand. I caught myself becoming more cautious, leaving my room less often, speaking briefly, looking at the floor. But Nick, he was different. He hadn't changed, at least not outwardly. But there was something elusive in his gaze now, something that made me feel both small and targeted. It happened on Saturday evening. Martin had gone on another business trip, and the house was especially quiet, too quiet. I lay on the couch in the living room, trying to watch an old movie, but I couldn't focus. The room was dark, with only the soft glow of the screen casting light on the walls. I heard Nick come down the stairs, but I didn't turn around. "Hi," he said, his voice low and calm. "Hi," I replied, not taking my eyes off the screen. He came closer, then sat on the other end of the couch. There was still enough space between us for me to breathe, but his presence was too palpable. This space felt fragile, like a bridge over an abyss, ready to collapse at any moment. We sat in silence, but I felt his gaze studying me. He didn't try to hide it, and that only intensified my nervousness. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore, and turned to him. "What?" I asked sharply, trying to sound firm, but my voice trembled. He smirked, as if amused by my discomfort. "Nothing," he replied calmly. "Just thinking." "About what?" I asked, trying to maintain my composure. Nick was silent for a few seconds, then slightly tilted his head. "About you." My heart raced. The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. His words hung in the air like an invisible thread stretched between us. I looked away, pretending to watch the movie. "You shouldn't say such things," I finally said, trying to sound stern. "Why?" he asked, his voice growing softer, almost a whisper. "Isn't it true?" "Nick," I turned to him, trying to look firm. "We can't. This is wrong." "What's wrong?" He slightly smiled, but there was no mockery in his eyes. "That you're beautiful? That you deserve more than just empty words from Martin?" His words hit me like a punch in the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but said nothing. He continued, his voice low and intimate. "I've seen how you look at me, Diana. Do you think I didn't notice?" This is your imagination," I managed to say, but my words sounded hollow. Nick shook his head, smiling at the corner of his mouth. "I don't think so." I stood up, trying to end the conversation, but he suddenly reached out and grabbed my hand. His touch was light, but it pierced me to the core. "Diana," he said, and his voice changed. It was no longer playful. There was sincerity in it that sent shivers down my spine. "I don't want you to be unhappy." I froze, unable to move. His words penetrated straight to my heart, shattering the fragile defense I had built around myself. He let go of my hand, but his gaze remained fixed on me. "I think you don't want that either," he added. I couldn't respond. The whole room spun around me, and I did the only thing I could. I turned around and left, leaving him alone. But even as I closed the bedroom door and lay on the bed, his words continued to echo in my head. He's right. I was unhappy. But was that really an excuse for letting things go this far? The morning was clear and calm, but there was something else in the house, an invisible tension that had become familiar, but no less frightening. I stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard. The sun played in the dewdrops on the grass, but I couldn't enjoy the view. My thoughts were elsewhere. The events of the previous night played over and over in my head like a worn-out tape. His words, his gaze, the inexpressible that hung in the air between us. It was too much to bear, but I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't believe this was happening to me. The sound of footsteps behind me made me jump. I turned around. Nick stood in the kitchen doorway, just as calm, just as confident. In his hands was a mug of coffee, and he lazily sipped from it, looking at me as if he could see all my thoughts. "You're up early," he said, coming closer. "Yes," I replied curtly, turning back to the window. I needed to find a way to leave the room, create distance. But instead, I remained standing, as if paralyzed. "Have you always been like this?" he asked suddenly. I frowned and turned to him. "Like what?" "Restrained," he said, taking another sip, "as if you're constantly holding something inside instead of just letting go." His words hit a nerve, maybe because they were true. "Everyone has boundaries, Nick," I said firmly, trying to regain control. "They need to be respected." "Really?" He raised an eyebrow, and a smirk played at the corner of his mouth. "Then why do I get the feeling you don't know where your boundaries are?" I felt a cold anger wash over me. He was pushing me again, testing how far he could go. And what was worse, he was right. I really didn't know where my boundaries ended. "You're wrong," I replied, trying to sound confident, "and you've crossed a line." "Maybe," he admitted, tilting his head as if studying me, "but I think you don't entirely dislike it." That was the last straw. I abruptly set the mug on the counter and walked past him, intending to leave the kitchen. But he stopped me, taking my hand. His touch was strong but gentle, as if he wanted me to stay but didn't want to scare me. "Diana," he said my name in a way that took my breath away. "Tell me I'm wrong. Say it and I'll stop." His voice was soft, almost pleading. I looked up and our eyes met. In his dark eyes I saw sincerity mixed with something else, a feeling I was afraid to name. "Nick," I finally managed to say, trying to find the right words. This is wrong." "Why?" he asked, taking a step closer. "Because someone once said it's wrong? Or because you really don't want it?" My chest heaved and I tried to pull my hand away, but he didn't let go. His fingers slightly loosened their grip, but he didn't back down. I began, but the words stuck in my throat. "If this is wrong, tell me now, and I'll go," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "But if you can't—" He didn't finish the sentence, but I didn't need him to. I understood what he was trying to say, and that scared me the most. I yanked my hand away and, without saying a word, ran upstairs. In the bedroom, I locked the door and leaned against it, feeling my legs give way. My heart was pounding as if it wanted to burst out of my chest. I stared at one spot on the wall, trying to catch my breath, but all I could hear was his voice. "Tell me I'm wrong." I replayed that moment over and over, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that I no longer knew where my truth ended and the lies began. I avoided Nick all day, locking myself in the bedroom under the pretext of work. But even behind the closed door, his presence haunted me. His words, his voice, his gaze from which there was no escape. I knew he was somewhere in the house, that his silence was not a sign of retreat but of waiting, and that scared me the most. By evening, I went downstairs trying to appear nonchalant. The kitchen was filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, but the room was empty. I breathed a sigh of relief when I heard noise from the living room. Nick apparently was there, and that gave me temporary space to gather my thoughts. I poured myself some coffee and stood by the window. The sky was darkening, transitioning from warm orange to deep blue, but my head was too crowded to notice the beauty of the sunset. Every breath felt like a struggle. My hands trembled as I brought the mug to my lips. "You finally came out of your cave," his voice came from behind me, soft and unhurried as always. I turned around, trying not to show my embarrassment. Nick stood in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame, his hands in his pockets. His gaze was insistent but not aggressive, more like studying. "I just wanted some coffee," I replied, trying to sound calm. He nodded but didn't move. Instead, he continued to look at me as if trying to read between the lines. "You've been avoiding me all day," he said. "Don't imagine things," I objected, trying to maintain control. "I had work to do." "Work?" he repeated with a slight smirk, as if he didn't believe me. "You know, Diana, you're not very good at hiding your feelings." I lowered my gaze, gripping the mug tighter than I should have. He came closer, his steps slow, as if he didn't want to scare me, but each movement echoed within me with a troubling resonance. "Stop, Nick," I said softly before he could get too close. "Stop what?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that made me catch my breath. "Saying what you already know? Or looking at you the way you're afraid of, but want to be looked at?" I looked up and our eyes met. His face was so close that I could see every tiny detail of his features, the sharp line of his jaw, the darkness of his eyes in which I was losing myself. "You don't understand what you're doing," I managed to say, but my voice trembled. "On the contrary, I understand perfectly," he said, and there was something firm, almost unyielding in his voice. "And you—" I stepped back, but I bumped into the edge of the table. Nick stopped just a few inches away from me, his warmth almost palpable. "Are you afraid?" he asked softly. "Yes," I whispered, unable to lie. "Of what?" He leaned in closer, his voice almost a whisper. "Yourself? Or me?" His words struck at the core. I swallowed, feeling a bitter lump rise in my throat. He was right. All this time I had been afraid not only of him, I had been afraid of myself, of my own feelings, of my reactions. I had been afraid of what I could no longer stop. He slowly raised his hand and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His touch was gentle, barely perceptible, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. "Do you want me to go?" he asked, and his voice was so soft I could barely hear it. I should have said yes. This was my chance to put an end to it all. But instead I just looked at him, unable to say a word. He understood my answer. His hand paused for a moment, then gently slid down my cheek. That movement made me close my eyes. At that moment, I was no longer myself, a woman, a wife, a rational person. I was something else, someone who had succumbed to something inevitable. "Tell me to stop, Diana," he said again, his voice husky, almost pleading, but I couldn't. Instead, I opened my eyes and looked at him, and in that gaze was everything that needed to be said. The world as I knew it disappeared. The house was enveloped in a dead silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. It was a sound I usually didn't notice, but now it echoed in my head, as if counting the seconds to something inevitable. I stood by the window, looking out at the empty street in front of the house, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Memories of last night swirled in a whirlwind, blurring any clear view. I couldn't stop feeling his touch, hearing his voice, which still echoed in my consciousness. It was wrong. I knew it. Every rational corner of my mind screamed at me about it. But something stronger than reason pulled me deeper. It was like a bottomless lake, dark and cold, but enticing with its calm. Nick entered the room, interrupting my thoughts. I heard his footsteps before he spoke. "You've been avoiding me all day again," he said, his voice calm but tense. I turned to him. He stood in the doorway, his hands in his jeans pockets. There was something new in his gaze. Resolve. "We need to talk," he said. I silently looked at him, unable to gather my thoughts. All I could do was nod. He came closer but stopped at arm's length. His gaze was focused, intense, as if he was trying to choose words that wouldn't shatter everything completely. "I can't take this anymore, Diana," he finally said. "What's between us, it's not just a mistake or an impulse. It's something more." "Nick, please," I began, but he interrupted. "No, let me finish," he said, his voice a bit louder. "I can't pretend anymore that this doesn't matter. And you?" My heart skipped a beat. He looked at me, waiting for an answer. But I didn't know what to say. Everything was confused. I felt like I was choking under the weight of his words, my emotions, the whole situation. I don't know, I finally managed to say, my voice weak, like that of someone who had given up under the weight of truth. I just don't know, Nick. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't look surprised. More like disappointed. He took a step closer, almost touching me, and his voice became soft but firm. You know, you've always known. Those words crashed down on me like an avalanche. He was right. I knew. All this time I had been trying to push the truth away, hide it under a layer of guilt and doubt, but it was there, deep within me, burning and unstoppable. I looked up, and at that moment all the walls I had tried to build crumbled. Between us, there were no more boundaries, no more distance. His hand touched my cheek, and I didn't pull away. You have to make a decision, he said softly. Either we continue this, or we stop. Forever. His words were simple, but they carried weight. This was my last chance to choose to put an end to it. I closed my eyes, feeling a storm raging inside me. When I opened them, he was still there, his gaze piercing me, but not pressing. He was waiting, and I realized I couldn't wait anymore. I couldn't hide anymore. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us, and reached up to touch his face. His eyes widened, but he didn't pull away. I can't stop this, I whispered, feeling tears well up in my eyes. I can't. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer. And at that moment, the world disappeared. There was only him, only us. Later, as the night sky covered the house, we lay in silence, our breaths merging. Reality slowly returned, like an icy wind seeping through the cracks. What now? I asked, looking at the ceiling. Now, he repeated, his voice low and calm. Now we go all the way. I turned to him, seeing his face illuminated by the moonlight. His gaze was serious, firm, and I understood. There was no way back. We had crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed. At that moment, I decided to live with this choice, but the fear of where this path would lead us remained.